Welcome to Libeth. There are almost no characters in the unfettered mind. In the conventional sense, figures who develop across time, who want specific things, who change in response to what happens to them. The text is nearly empty. What it has instead are presences. A monk author whose voice runs through all three letters, a swordsman recipient whose situation is the text's entire occasion, an opponent who never appears, a legendary sword, and two Buddhist deities invoked as images rather than actors. That thinness is not a poverty of imagination. It is a precise choice. The unfettered mind is not interested in character in the novelistic sense because it is not interested in the individual self as such. It is interested in the relationship between the self and action, in the question of what happens to identity when performance is pushed past the threshold where identity becomes a liability. Every figure in the text serves that interest, and none of them is permitted to exceed it. Takuan Sōhō was born in 1573, which places his origin inside the Sengoku period, the era of constant civil war that had been consuming Japan for over a century. He grew up in a country organized around violence, in which the local strongmen who commanded armies held actual power, and the aristocratic institutions in Kyoto retained only ceremonial authority. His family was not samurai. He came from below the warrior class, from the stratum of society that the formal hierarchy placed beneath those who governed and those who fought. His entry into the Buddhist clergy was, among other things, a movement across a social boundary that the secular world would not otherwise have permitted him to cross. Buddhism in Japan had always offered an alternative axis of prestige, one organized around spiritual attainment rather than hereditary rank, through which a person of modest origins could accumulate a form of authority that the secular hierarchy could not easily deny. Takuan used that axis with extraordinary effectiveness. By his middle age, he was a senior figure in the Rinzai school, one of the two major branches of Japanese Zen, and the Rinzai lineage he belonged to was not the gentle, aesthetic Zen of popular Western imagination. It was rigorous, intellectually demanding, historically associated with the samurai class and the cultural elite, organized around the koan practice that used unanswerable questions as instruments of cognitive exhaustion. The Rinzai tradition understood that the mind's habits of categorization and deliberation were not merely useful tools that sometimes got in the way. They were, at a certain depth, the obstacle itself. That understanding is what Takuan brings to these letters. His exile in 1629 is the event in his biography that most directly illuminates the character he presents in the text. The shogunate attempted to intervene in the appointment of the abbot of one of the most important Zen temples, to install a candidate whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than spiritual standing. Takuan protested, openly, in writing, as one of a group of senior clergy who refused to accept that the integrity of the religious lineage was a matter for the secular government to decide. He was stripped of his rank and exiled to Kamineyama, a domain in the north, cold and remote, far from Edo and from the networks of intellectual and social life he had inhabited. The punishment was real. It was designed to demonstrate, visibly and humiliatingly, that the Buddhist establishment's autonomy existed at the pleasure of the state, and that any senior figure who made that autonomy a political issue would find himself removed from everything he had built. Takuan accepted the exile without recanting. He spent his years at Kamineyama writing, practicing, maintaining his intellectual life and his monastic discipline in conditions that offered very little external support for either. What does this exile mean for the character who writes the Unfettered Mind? It means that when Takuan writes about non-attachment, about the mind that cannot be moved by external pressure, about the freedom that exists when the self has no fixed position to defend, he is writing from experience rather than from doctrine alone. He had been tested by precisely the kind of force that most destroys the non-attached life: exile, humiliation, the removal of status and influence, and the daily texture of a meaningful professional existence. He did not break. He was eventually rehabilitated. The political climate shifted. He was recalled, and he ended his life with his own temple granted by the third Shogun Iemitsu, his position and reputation fully restored. But the rehabilitation came from outside. The continuity came from inside. The man who survived the exile intact returned as the same person who had been exiled, which is itself an argument for the psychological reality of what he's describing. There is a further tension in Takuan's character that the text does not acknowledge, but that the careful reader will feel. He is writing about non-attachment and about the freedom of the mind that has no fixed home, from a position of significant entanglement with exactly the institutions and political relationships that constrain freedom. He was close to power. He moved in the circles of the shogunal establishment, knew Munenori as a peer, was eventually granted a temple by the shogun himself. His personal history is a history of navigating institutional politics with considerable skill, of knowing when to resist and when to accept, of managing relationships across competing centers of authority with the kind of sophistication that the non-attached mind, in theory, should not need. This tension between the argument and the life does not undermine the argument. It gives the argument its full weight. Non-attachment, as Takuan describes it, is not the condition of someone who has removed themselves from the world. It is the condition of someone who is fully in the world, fully engaged with its demands and its dangers and its constraints, and who is nevertheless not held hostage by any of it. The exile survived. The political player navigated. The writer of letters to the shogun's swordsman inhabited all of these simultaneously. His authority is the authority of a man who has done the thing, not just described it. Yagyū Munenori is, in biographical terms, almost a mirror image. Born in 1571, just 2 years before Takuan, he also grew up during the wars and came of age in the period of consolidation that followed Sekigahara. His family had been practitioners of the Shinkage-ryu school of swordsmanship for generations, a lineage with a distinctive philosophical orientation that emphasized strategic psychology and mental disruption as much as physical technique. The school had understood, before Takuan wrote a word, that the primary theater of swordsmanship was not the body but the mind, that the practitioner who could disturb the opponent's attention, who could create hesitation or fixation, who could manipulate the opponent's perceptual field before the swords crossed, had already won the decisive engagement. Munenori had grown up inside that understanding. He had inherited not just a set of techniques, but a philosophical orientation toward combat that was, in its own way, already moving in the direction Takuan's letters would push explicitly. His position as official sword instructor to the Tokugawa house was not simply a martial honor. It was a political function. The shogun's identity as a warrior, the ideological foundation of the regimes, claimed to govern through the authority of the military class, required visible, ongoing performance. The shogun trained. The shogun was seen to train. And the man who trained the shogun was, in the symbolic economy of the regime, one of the most important figures in the legitimation of Tokugawa authority. Munenori understood this. He operated with the political sophistication that a man in that position had to develop in order to survive proximity to power, which is not the same as the proximity of the ordinary retainer. The man who teaches the shogun has access that others do not, and that access is both privilege and danger, because the man who is always closest to the center is also the man whose failures are most visible and whose indiscretions are most consequential. He was also a writer. His Heihō Kadensho, Family Traditions on the Art of War, is a text that stands in a direct relationship to Takuan's letters, and if you read them together, the relationship is impossible to miss. Munenori absorbed Takuan's influence so thoroughly that distinguishing his own voice from the monks is sometimes difficult. The language of the abiding mind, the analysis of how fixation becomes vulnerability, the identification of the self-watching consciousness as the primary obstacle to peak performance. All of this appears in Munenori's own writing in a form that suggests not merely that he received these ideas, but that he tested them against his own decades of martial experience and found them confirmed. The recipient of the letters was not simply a student receiving instruction from a teacher. He was a man of equivalent depth in a different domain, and the exchange between them produced a genuinely collaborative intellectual achievement that neither could have reached independently. What Munenori represents in the text, as a character, is proof. Proof that the highest level of martial mastery does not stay inside its original domain, that it opens, inevitably, into philosophy, into questions about consciousness and identity, and the relationship between knowledge and action that are not martial questions at all. He is the evidence that Takuan's argument is not a monk's abstraction, imposed on a tradition that doesn't need it. He is the tradition itself, at its furthest point of development, discovering that it needs exactly what Takuan is offering. His presence in the text says, "This is where the sword goes when it has gone far enough." The opponent is the text's most significant structural absence. Never named, never described, never given qualities or a body or intentions. The opponent exists in the unfettered mind only as pressure, as the condition under which the mind's defects become visible and consequential. In Zen terms, this absence is exact. The opponent is not the person standing across from you in the duel. The opponent is the structure of the test, the situation in which your mind will reveal what it is made of, in which every stopping place, every abiding location, every moment of self-consciousness will be exposed and exploited. In that sense, the opponent is you. Not as a metaphor, as a description of what is actually happening in the critical moment. You are being defeated by your own mind's tendency to fix, to watch, to hesitate, to maintain the story of itself in a situation that requires the story to stop. The absence of the opponent from the text is also an argument about where the real work happens. If the opponent were present, described, characterized, given strategic qualities, the text would become a book about external adversaries and how to defeat them. It would shift from a philosophy of consciousness to a manual of tactical psychology. By keeping the opponent absent, Takuan keeps the entire weight of the argument on the interior. The question is never what the opponent will do. The question is what your mind does when it cannot afford to do the wrong thing. The answer to that question has nothing to do with the specific qualities of any specific opponent. It has to do with the quality of your mind, the depth of your training, and this is the part that cannot be trained directly. Whether you have been able to release that training into the body and let the body act without the mind's supervision. The sword, not a sword, but the teia, the mythological blade of the second letter, operates as a character in the text in the way that certain objects in literature become charged with symbolic energy that exceeds their physical function. The teia was a sword so perfect that it was said to cut without the cutter's intention directing it, to act through the practitioner rather than being wielded by them. That quality of acting through rather than being wielded is exactly what Takuan is trying to describe in the mind. The sword that gives life is the sword that is no longer in the hands of an ego with a project. It is the sword acting through a mind that has become transparent to the situation's demands. And the sword that kills, not in the literal sense of ending a life, but in the deeper sense that Takuan intends, is the sword in the hands of a self with an agenda, a self that is present in the action as an author rather than as a medium. The legendary perfection of the teia is not about the blade's physical qualities. It is about the quality of consciousness that the blade, in the legend, represents and demands. Feudo Myo-o Macron appears in the text's opening letter as a visual argument. The deity is always depicted in Japanese Buddhist iconography with an expression of absolute ferocity, surrounded by flames, holding a sword that cuts through obstacles to liberation, holding a rope that binds the destructive forces of delusion, with a posture that radiates total dynamic tension. He is the immovable one, and his immovability is always depicted not as stillness, but as complete and total readiness. A body in which every possible action is equally available, equally immediate, equally complete. The flames around him are not decoration. They are the transformation of ignorance into wisdom, the energy of delusion redirected rather than suppressed. He is ferocious because genuine compassion, operating at the level Takuan is describing, does not look gentle from the outside. He is immovable because he has no fixed position from which movement could dislodge him. He is always already in the middle of the action that the situation requires. He is the visual embodiment of the argument that the unfettered mind is not peaceful in the aesthetic sense. It is peaceful in the structural sense. It cannot be disturbed, not because nothing disturbs it, but because disturbance requires a fixed point to move, and this mind has no such point. Canon Avalokitesvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, appears as the counterpoint image, and together the two deities form the complete picture of what Takuan is pointing toward. Where Feudo is ferocity and absolute commitment, Canon is responsiveness and infinite adaptability. The thousand-armed iconography that represents Canon in Japan, each arm holding a different implement, each instrument appropriate to a different form of suffering, is an image of action without deliberation operating at cosmic scale. 1,000 arms that move simultaneously, each responding to what is needed without waiting for a central authority to assess the situation and issue a directive. No committee. No deliberation. No self-monitoring the 1,000 responses from above. Each arm acts from the nature of what it is, in response to the nature of what is needed, and the result is a kind of total, simultaneous care that a deliberating mind could not produce. This is what the unfettered mind looks like in the register of compassion rather than combat, not the ferocious commitment of Feudo, but the inexhaustible responsiveness of Canon. Both images are pointing at the same quality of consciousness, the mind that acts without the friction of the self that watches itself act. Before arriving at the closing synthesis, it is worth pausing on what the text's figures share at the level of their social and historical situation, because the specific historical moment of early Edo Japan is not incidental to the kinds of figures the text contains. Every person and every image in the unfettered mind is someone who exists at the intersection of enormous formal power and structural constraint. Takuan is a senior religious figure in an institution that the state is actively absorbing into its administrative apparatus. Munenori is the shogun's sword instructor in a state that has made the shogun's martial identity a political performance. He is at once the regime's most intimate servant and its most visible reminder of the violence that the regime was built on. The opponent exists as the structuring pressure of a social system that has produced warriors with no war to fight. The Teia is a legendary instrument of discriminating wisdom in a world where the categories of discrimination have been officially fixed by state ideology. Even Fudo Myo-o Macron, the wrathful deity of the esoteric Buddhist tradition, has been domesticated into the Tokugawa religious establishment, his image reproduced in the temples that were simultaneously spiritual institutions and census machinery. What all of these figures share is the condition of being fully embedded in a system that constrains them, while simultaneously pointing toward something that the system cannot contain. Takuan is constrained by the shogunate and writes about the freedom that no state can reach. Munenori is constrained by his proximity to power and writes about the release of the self that proximity to power most requires you to maintain. The absent opponent is the limit that the system sets, the test that reveals what the system's training has and hasn't prepared you for. The Teia is the instrument of a wisdom that transcends the categories the system has organized to manage wisdom institutionally. And Fudo is the image of a commitment so total that no institutional structure is large enough to contain its object. The text's characters are all versions of the same human situation, embedded in constraint, pointing toward what the constraint cannot reach. That pointing across such different registers, from such different positions, is what gives the text its force, and what makes it speak across the 4 centuries that separate its occasion from ours. The text's characters, taken together, form a complete phenomenology of the problem. Takuan, the authority of insight without force, the life that has been tested and survived, the voice that reaches past technique to the structure of consciousness. Munenori, the limit of technique embodied, the proof that mastery asks the question that only philosophy can answer. The absent opponent, the mirror that reveals the mind's defects by threatening to exploit them. The Teia, the instrument that acts through rather than being wielded by, the image of what transparency to the situation looks like in physical form. Fudo, the ferocity of complete commitment, the immovability that is also total readiness. Canon, the responsiveness of the mind with no agenda, the care that doesn't need to decide. Between them, these figures describe every dimension of the unfettered mind. Not by explaining it, but by showing it from different angles, each angle adding something the others don't have, until the reader has circled the thing completely, and if the reading has worked, knows it without being able to say what they know. One new book every week. At least we try.